So, in language research or in reading research, we know from behavioral experiments and computational models that the conversion of orthographic or written language into phonological language or speech involves two separate mechanisms, as described here by roots of the connectionless dual process model. The non-lexical root analyzes written language as series of graphemes by using consistent relationships to convert single graphemes into phonemes. Subsequently, these phonemes were assembled within the phonological output buffer and compared to entries in the phonological lexicon. This root can be used for reading and understanding of regular words like few and is necessary for reading artificial pseudo-words like tew. In contrast, the lexical root requires item-specific knowledge to map the orthographic form of individual words directly on semantics without single grapheme to phoneme conversions. This root is necessary for reading irregular words like so, where the consistencies in the grapheme to phoneme conversions do not fit. In experienced readers, both roots were active in parallel and were both necessary to explain human reading. Studies applying methods with high temporal resolution have suggested specific serial order effects of these linguistic components. Early potentials reflect primary perceptual components. Intermediate potentials reflect sublexical and lexical components, while semantic processing occurs around 400 to 600 milliseconds. So we are very fast in processing written language because we are so experienced in reading. For methods with high spatial resolution, such as fMRI, this fast processing speed and the slow sampling rates in scales of seconds are a problem in reading imaging. It is nearly impossible to investigate serial linguistic components during processing using fMRI. But can we circumvent this temporal problem in reading imaging by using a different coding system than written language, where subjects do not have decades of experience in processing? To test this, we use the International Morse Code as a model of language for reading. As series of short and long tones, the Morse Code can be used to encode alphabetic languages like English or Italy. For understanding Morse Code, these sequences had to be converted into phonemes first, involving similar mechanisms as described by the connectionless dual process model. So using Morse Code as a model for reading has mainly two advantages. First, because of the limited experience with Morse Code, the cognitive processes related to language decoding, like reading, were slowed down. In this way, it became possible to investigate serial linguistic components using fMRI. Second, we got a highly controlled learning environment that allows us to teach our subjects only to decode single Morse code letters. In this way, no orthographic or item-specific lexicon for Morse code can be built up, which allows us to test exclusively the non-lexical root of the connectionless dual process model. So after our subjects learned to decode single Morse code letters, they performed the lexical decision task in the MRI scanner. Here, words and non-words were presented as Morse code, and the subjects had to decide whether the presented stimuli were meaningful, meaningless, or just a control tone. To analyze serial components, we first defined two temporal regressors, each for words and non-words, and contrasted them as followed. So one early regressor reflects components relevant for sublexical processing, shown in light gray. The later regressor reflects components relevant for lexicosemantic processing, shown in dark gray. So to make a lexical decision, words and non-words had to be processed sublexically first during stimulus presentation. Afterwards, both were analyzed lexically, but only words gain access to the semantic system. As a result, we found a left-right network for sublexical processing comprising the inferior frontal gyrus, the precentral gyrus, and the inferior parietal lobe. During lexical processing, shown in yellow, the activation pattern in the parietal lobe is extending towards superior parietal and the occipital cortex. The pattern in the frontal cortex stays quite constant, showing high overlap with the network for sublexical processing as shown in green. This lexical network was the same for words and non-words. In addition, only meaningful words showed activity of the left angular gyrus, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the precuneus. These regions are part of the default mode network, typically associated with rest. So based on the temporal signature and the defined contrast, we can now conclude that the default mode network is part of the semantic system. and that it's at least likely that a part of the inferior parietal lobe is involved in the phonological lexicon. However, whether the sublexical components or the phonological output buffer were located in the frontal or parietal cortex can't be answered based on the current results. By checking the literature, a labeling for specific regions is possible with different solutions. There's great evidence that the semantic system highly overlaps with regions of the default mode network, and that indeed the inferior parietal lobe is involved in the phonological lexicon. Based on the literature, we can also conclude that the motor area is more involved in speech motor control and silent articulation during reading, while the inferior frontal gyrus can be related to phonological output computation. In addition to the phonological lexicon, there's also evidence that relates the inferior parietal lobe to the sublexical system and single grapheme to phoneme conversions. Nevertheless, there's also evidence supporting different solutions. There's evidence for an involvement of the frontal cortex in sublexical components, as well as evidence for different mappings in the parietal cortex. What to conclude here is that decoding Morse code relies on the same regions that are also necessary for processing written language. Although Morse code is based on auditory sequences and therefore differs to visual letters, it can be used to investigate the processes of reading. Finally, I want to show you the results of another approach where we reanalyze the data in a more time-resolved manner. Here we use the so-called stick function model that reflects the basic hemodynamic response function at a specific time point. Similar to a sliding window approach, this stick function model was moved to the completely processing period, which allows us to estimate brain's activity during Morse code reading in real time. So in violet, you will see the estimated activity pattern common for words and non-words. In red, you will see the activity that is unique for words, and I would like to focus your attention on the left inferior parietal lobe. Here we will see a spread of activation after stimulus offset that might reflect the phonological lexicon and give the impression of triggering activity in the semantic system for meaningful stimuli. Now we see the first activity. Now we see the spread of activity in the parietal lobe that seems to trigger the default mode network. Perhaps once more. Sorry. Okay, I hope that I could convince you that decoding Morse code relies on the same regions that are also necessary for processing written language. Therefore, we believe that we can really use Morse code as a model for reading. And I hope that you can get at least the first impression that using Morse code as a model for reading can be beneficial for reading imaging by slowing down the cognitive processes of reading within a controlled learning environment. Then I want to thank German Research Foundation for founding, the organizers of the OHBM for the opportunity to present the concept of using Morse code as a model for reading, and you for your attention.